All right, somebody the other day asked me to do a video on pneumatics. Air comes from the engine. Obviously, we use it to air condition the airplane, hot air, hot, cold air, pressurize the airplane, use it for various other things. But for our purposes today, we're going to go over the pneumatic system. We have low pressure bleed air that comes out of P2.5, which is the fifth stage of compression in an axial engine, and we have P3 air that comes out of P3.0, which is the sixth stage of compression. P2.5 air comes out of the engine, up and over, through a check valve so that air in this part of the system can't go back into the engine. Once it goes through there and gets to this intersection, it can go one of two ways. It can either go down through a pre-cooler down to the boots, so we have air for our boots, or it can go through the low pressure bleed valve en route to the air cycle machine. We'll talk about the air cycle machine in a different video, but for now we're just going to talk about low pressure, high pressure bleed air. The high pressure bleed air comes off that sixth stage of compression, goes through the high pressure bleed valve when it's open, and we'll talk about that. It goes through a pre-cooler, larger than the other one it appears, combines with low pressure bleed air, gets to this intersection, some of it goes to the boots, and the rest of it goes to the low pressure bleed valve. Now let's talk about this low pressure bleed valve. This low pressure bleed valve itself will close automatically for certain things. This switch is what controls our low pressure bleed valve. There's a reset auto, and a closed position out valve. So I control the position of this valve. As long as there's air flowing across that valve at 10 psi, that valve will move, closed or open. In the case of a loss of power to the aircraft, this valve will default to open because low pressure bleed air is considered safer air than high pressure bleed air. High pressure bleed air is hotter, it's under higher pressure, and therefore this valve, in case of a loss of power, will default to closed position. Anyway, this valve itself opens and closes based upon this switch. If there are problems within the system, this valve will close. One of the problems is if air on this side of the low pressure bleed valve is too hot, this valve will close automatically. It will be depicted by a bleed fault light, followed by a bleed close light, and both lights will remain illuminated. Very important to think that even if this valve closes, this temperature will still be being sensed at this sensor, and therefore I will still keep the bleed fault light. Another thing that can cause the low pressure bleed valve to close is pressure. If pressure on the downstream side of this valve is too high, this bleed valve will close automatically. It will be depicted by initially a bleed fault light. When the valve itself closes, bleed close light will come on and the bleed fault light will extinguish. That's because once this valve closes, pressure is no longer being sensed at this pressure switch. Now, high pressure bleed air. This valve normally is in the closed position. During climb out, first flight of the day, cold soaked engine, these should be in auto. But the high pressure bleed valve switches should be enclosed for takeoff and departure. We only put those into auto once we're in climb. First time this valve will open is when power is pulled back and there is insufficient low pressure bleed air to do everything that needs to be done over here. This valve will open when it senses pressure at this switch less than 76 psi. Now, I can't read that on a gauge, so I don't care what that number is, but when there's insufficient pressure at the switch, it tells the HP bleed valve to open because the logic of the valve states at 76 psi, there's way too little low pressure bleed air to supply the system. Therefore, I have to open up and do my job. This typically is going to be either in your descent when your power's back, or it could be in cruise if you pull your power back just to fly slow. Now, continuing on. This light right here, the HP highlight, think of as a bleed fault light for the low pressure system. This light on is going to require us to pull out a QRH to ensure that this valve closes, because what's happened here is the HP valve has remained in the open position when it's not supposed to be. And remember, HP bleed air is much more dangerous than low pressure bleed air. Okay? In addition, on the low pressure bleed side, to temperature and pressure, other things that can close this low pressure bleed valve are the switch itself, going to the closed position, or pulling of a fire handle. Fire handle will actually send a closed logic message to both the HP and the low pressure bleed valves to close them automatically. There are two things within the air cycle machine that will cause the low pressure bleed valve to close, but we'll get to those on a different video. So 4 things: temperature, pressure, fire handle, and switch will cause the low pressure bleed valve to close. And for the high pressure bleed valve to close, it's fire handle, temperature, switch, and pressure. But note that the pressure on this one is a different pressure switch than the one for the low pressure bleed valve. HP bleed air is only there to supplement low pressure bleed air. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I appreciate any feedback. Let me know anything, any way that I can help. Thanks.